What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. It's time to take a look at Dragon Age Veilguard here on the ROG Ally X. Now, I've been testing this on the Legion Go and Steam Deck as well, and the deck video is already up. It's pretty tough to run there, but mostly playable. It's running pretty good here on the Ally X, even using just all official ASUS drivers, nothing sideloaded or extra here. So I want to take a look at some different performance here for 1080p, 720p, a little 900p, and some FSR. Settings-wise, we'll start off at 1080p, but we're going to make some adjustments as we get in. We're going to be using some FSR. I'll show you native as well. We'll just kind of go through a lot of these settings quickly in the beginning, and then we'll get into a little bit of gameplay, and you'll see plenty of performance here and decide if this game's running well enough for you to want to play on the Ally X. I think it will be. Now, as far as graphics, I'm just on the low preset with vignette off. You can definitely bump up the texture filtering and the textures a little bit. We have the VRAM to do that here on the Ally X, but any bump ups I was doing, even for textures, was hurting some of my performance. This thing's just kind of tough to run, so keep that in mind. Now, as far as wattage, because I know you guys will ask about this, 25 watts is what I'm using here in the video. Some games you can definitely crank down and they'll play great. Even like Black Ops is working well at 17 watts for me, but this game is just too demanding. 17 watts will come down from the 30s here to 23 FPS, and it becomes really unplayable, and we're just sitting still. This isn't even a demanding area. FPS gets worse as you get into combat and cities, so definitely doesn't work to try to save that battery. And if we jump up to 20 watts, which is where I play a lot of my games on the Z1 Extremes, we'll come just up above that 30, but it's not going to stay there. You'll be in the 20s and teens. So I really did have to go ahead and just stick with my 25 watts for this handheld mode, maxing things out that way, and it gave me enough performance here by a good bit to make the game playable. So that's what I'm going to stick with playing this in handheld mode. Now, 720p is very much the same way, 38 FPS sitting still here. If we go in and we'll drop this down to that 17 watts again, even though the 720p is taking pressure off the GPU, it really doesn't matter here. We tank back down to 24 FPS instead of 23 at 720p native here versus the FSR we were using on 1080p. And then back up to 25 watts, we'll come back up to that 37, 38 range that we were at with 1080p over there with that FSR. Now, if we get into the actual FSR at native, we're only 26 here, not going to work for 1080p. If we go to FSR quality, we get an instant bump, but again, the game gets much more demanding in other areas, but it does help. Another couple of FPS here when we go to balanced for 35 over that 33, so it'll help you out a little bit here. And then we can go over to performance, which is what I'm really going to use in some of the rest of the video as well. It looks okay on the smaller screen and works, but it gives me the FPS I'm looking for. And then ultra performance, which does get pretty rough, does help the most with the FPS, at least in this area. But I'm going to use performance for the gameplay in the video for 1080p. Adjust that how you want. Now, when it comes to 720p, native TA high, it looks great, and it matches the performance of 1080p performance FSR. So native is a good way to go if you want that for 720p. If we bump FSR quality here, we're going to go right up to 45 FPS. It might be something you need to do in areas where you're dipping. FSR balanced here at the 720, 48 FPS. And let's just jump all the way up to ultra performance, which is not going to look good at 720p, but almost gets you to that 60 FPS sitting still anyway, not in the other areas. So getting into a little bit of the gameplay, this area is a decent example. 1080p FSR performance here with that 25 watts. We're going to basically stay in those 30s in this area, which will work out just fine. At least gameplay is smooth, and there's not like a lot of frame time issues or stutters in the game, which is really nice to see. Having no DRM or de novo or anything probably helps that out here at launch as well. And at 720p, the same area here, 720p native TAA matches the performance of 1080p FSR performance basically. So that's kind of what I've been running here. I just think on the small screen the 720p native does look better than upscaling the 1080p that much, but you're going to be able to pick what preference you want to do there, or 900p, which we'll look at again later as well. Now again, there's areas of the game that will certainly take a hit in performance. So even at performance FSR here, 1080p, we do get down into the upper 20s in certain areas of the game. It's not been super common for me in my first 5 hours of play, but it can and will happen from time to time, but depending on where you're at. 720p native, basically the same exact performance here as that 1080p FSR balance. So pretty much whatever you want to adjust settings to for your resolution and your FSR, you should be able to get what you want here, but just be aware you're going to vary anywhere from that 28 all the way up into the 40s depending on where you're at and the combat and all that kind of stuff that's going to be going on for you. So I don't know, I think 1080p FSR quality or balanced would also kind of get you there. It depends on if you're going to up those textures, if you're going to be using 720p or 1080p. there's a lot of room to play around. You're not really going to be able to lower that wattage much. You're not going to be able to up those settings very much, but you'll be able to use different upscaling or native or that kind of thing and get the performance that you're looking for out of the game. So we've talked a lot about 1080p and 720p, but what about 900p, which is a sweet spot for a lot of people? Well, that, as usual, falls right between 720p and 1080p, which is why I don't always show it. But from 53 to 44 FPS here, 9 or 10 FPS loss at native from 720p to 900p native here. So it works in some areas, but not all. You'll probably wind up wanting to use some upscaling, and depending on where you're at, of course, just like anything else in combat, all those different things, cities, will completely depend on your performance if you're more like 28 to 30 or if you're all the way up into the 40s. And when you get into those same combat areas I was in at 1080p and 720p, instead of that 38 FPS or so we could hold, we're down to 29 to 31, which again, it's going to get worse in other areas of the game, which is why I say you might want to use some upscaling. If I just hit quality, we go up to 38 FPS, which matches the 1080p FSR performance and the 720p native performance. Again, right in between those two resolutions. That's what you fall with 900p if you want to play the game that way. It's a great sweet spot, continues to be here on the Ally X and the regular Ally, and it just depends on what game you're playing if you want to go that way and the performance. So I definitely want to go over that. Now, AFMF comes in the Adrenaline app if you're looking for some frame generation. I didn't like it in the game. Of course, this is only the official driver, so it's only AFMF 1, and it hits performance pretty hard. And it doesn't really help a lot. It doesn't look great. It doesn't feel great playing it. You can certainly enable it in the app. I have it to some shortcuts on the controller, but it is available if you're using the official drivers. It's just not something I felt was needed in this game. You can get much better visuals and latency and all of that just by running a game at different resolutions and upscalers that way. Alright guys, I think this will give you a good enough of an idea of how Dragon Age Veilguard is playing on the ROG Ally X. There's a lot of room to play around, not so much with the settings, a little bit with the textures if you want, but really with the upscaling and the resolution, and probably keeping around that 25 watts. Alright guys, thanks a lot for coming to check out the video. As always, I really appreciate it, and I'll see you in the next one.